next week, and then the next two, I guess, is TDB. I don't know exactly what Gerald's schedule is, but we're working it out. So, but nevertheless, it'll probably be within a couple weeks from now. But anyways, we're going to be diving into the book of Jonah and kind of seeing what it reveals. So here I got an outline. I don't know if everyone can see it or not, of what we're going to kind of talk about. We're going to go in kind of the history. So the week one is going to be kind of laying out the history, the setting, what's going on, kind of give us the background of what Jonah was going through, and why he, some of the questions of why he chose to do what he did, where he was going, why he was going there, and as we dig in actually into the text, we'll get more into that. But today we're going to get into the history, people's perspectives on it, a little bit about Jonah, hopefully to the first two verses of Jonah. We'll kind of dive in a little bit into that, and then kind of get our feet wet there. So, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and start out. So, Jonah was actually written no later than 760 BC. And what's interesting is Jonah is actually referred to in 2 Kings 14:25. So, if someone wants to open that up, we can take a little read of that real quick and talk about it.
The one who restored the boundaries of Israel.
Yep.
From Lebo Hamath to the sea of the Arab Bob, I don't know, in accordance with the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, spoken through his servant Jonah, son of
We'll call him Amadi. He's Italian.
The prophet. Why did I volunteer? From God Heifer. I don't know. I'm saying that wrong, I'm sure.
Cool.
That's
Yeah, there's two Italians in the Bible, if you didn't know. It's Malachi and Amadi right here. All right, so what's interesting about this passage is this is written in the book of Kings. It was underneath Jeroboam II, and it actually mentions Jonah by name. But the funny thing is, we really don't know who Amadi was really, but we know that Jonah was there in the northern kingdom, and his presence. I mean, obviously, he was so well known. He actually made it in the book of Kings, and that's a pretty big deal when it comes to the historical writings. So as we look in there, we actually see that he's from a place called Gath Hepher, and what that actually literally means is wine press. So it was actually a nearby town. They actually did a lot of trading and stuff out of it, but I bet you can only imagine what their main commodity was. It was wine. Imagine that. So basically, like I said before, Jonah was a prophet underneath Jeroboam II, which he actually reigned between 793 to 753 BC in the northern kingdom, and he was, well, most of all the kings were pretty horrible up there, really. but out of all the horrible kings, he wasn't as horrible at the time. So, but he was actually one of the little bit better ones. There was actually a reign of prosperity at the time. Things were kind of looking up for like a short period of time. But if we actually look in, if we were to turn to Kings, we're going to here, but if we were to turn to 2 Kings 13, 14, and 23, 27, it talks a little bit more about his reign, some of the different stuff. I don't want to focus so much on that, but it's just kind of wrap our brains around when this was actually happening. So this was actually happening right around 793 to 753 BC. So there's a lot of things getting ready to happen. And if you know anything about the Northern Kingdom, this is also about the time with the Assyrian captivity and everything started to go down. So Jonah's one of those people that's starting to warn about that. What else is kind of interesting about Jonah is Jesus actually refers to Jonah a couple different times. So if someone wants to turn to Matthew 12, 39 through 41, let's take a look at one of those.
But he answered them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here.
Right. And that's kind of the heart of what Jonah's going to kind of get into. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Well, we'll talk more specifically in that passage as we get more into the text later on. But Jesus only mentions a handful of prophets, and Jonah happened to be one of them. And what's interesting about it is when Jesus is talking about Jonah, he's not talking about a mythological guy, or he's not talking about some off distance person someone forgot about. People knew who Jonah was, and he was very, very specific on what Jonah did, and there's a lot of allusion. So some people call the whole going into the belly of the whale controversial. What really happened to Jonah when he was in there, and we'll dive into that a little bit later because there's a lot of fun with that. Go ahead.
I would say Jesus, it's really interesting because Jesus did refer many times to those things which we today find most controversial, what you just said. Like Adam and Eve,
Yeah.
and Jonah,
Right.
and other things like that, Noah.
Right. So, a couple questions here is, how do scholars regard the book of Jonah? I mean, what do you guys think? How do you think scholars would regard it? Skeptical, yeah. Most scholars actually look at the book of Jonah as just kind of either a myth or maybe
Children's spirit.
children's fairy tale, or basically maybe a story that has a little bit of truth, but they kind of blew it up to be something a little bit bigger.
Big fish story.
Yeah, exactly. Literally.
A lot of fish days.
Well, and the reason why this is because they get so hung up on the fact that Jonah was swallowed by either a great fish, and he survived it. And in their heads, they think that's impossible. But the reality is, well, there's a lot of things with that. Actually, there's a lot that we can dive in with that. But the reality is, the book's not about that. The book's actually not about Jonah being swallowed by the fish. The book is actually, believe it or not, about Christ. And there's a lot of allusion to it. One of the things that some of the notes here I've got to say, it's basically, it talks about the resurrection, the salvation, the unstoppable grace, Lord's faithfulness, and the fact that God is good all the time. And there's so many other things, but there's so many allusions in here to Christ. It's actually mind-boggling. And you got to remember, this was written back around 760 BC, and so there's a lot that's revealed as time goes on. And that was my next one. What is Jonah really about? And that is, it's really about Christ. And we're going to dive into some of those different points there where there's allusions to Christ, and I think it's really neat because there's a lot of little hidden fun stuff in there. Now, something else to kind of take note is this little pesky god Dagon. So this was actually a fish god that the Ninevites or the Assyrians, actually most of the Assyrian culture even goes back to the Babylonians, and we'll actually dive a little bit into that, into the historical side of it. They actually worshiped this fish god, and there's actually a reference to this back in 1 Samuel 5:2 through 5. So if someone wants to read that real quick, we'll talk a little bit about that.
At beside Dagon. And the people of Ashdod rose early the next day. There was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They took Dagon and put him back in his place. But the following morning when they rose, there was Dagon fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. His head and hands had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained. That is why to this day neither the priests of Dagon nor any others who enter Dagon's temple at Ashdod step on the threshold.
There it is. So, that was a very humbling moment for them, especially when we talk about the ark and who the ark represented. They saw that, and well, probably saw it as a threat. Probably a little bit before they actually saw that, but that was one of the big deals. They saw it as a threat. But what's interesting is we see the picture of that. So this Dagon is actually half fish, half man. So one of the things that's interesting is when Jonah went to Nineveh, he's coming there with this fish story. So they already have this perception of this fish god. And we're not, like I said, Beroeus, ancient historian, Greek historian, actually goes through basically one of their myths, and we'll dive into that here in a minute. But they were actually really receptive. That's why when we read about Jonah and he gives that message, hey, change your ways, and all like, okay, let's do it. You're like, these guys were, cold-blooded killers, and all of a sudden they just changed around. Well, when you start understanding a little bit more about Dagon and where they held him at, it makes a little bit more sense of what's really going on there. So we'll just kind of keep that in the back of our mind there as we move along. All right, so Nineveh. Nineveh, it fell in 612 BC. Nineveh was actually founded by Nimrod. Back in Genesis, we can actually find that. So it was actually one of those cities that was actually really big cities, had the big walls around and everything else. It was actually the New York City of the day and age at that time. They were really wealthy, prosperous, but during this time, believe it or not, they were actually kind of on their decline. Okay, now there was stronger powers building up, and actually later on, so in 612 BC, they actually fell to the Babylonians. So they actually came in and took them out. But what's interesting is, you think about Jonah's message, he actually delayed that because he knew that God had a judgment for Nineveh, and if they didn't change their ways, he was banking on it. He was banking on the fact that God was going to go in and actually judge Nineveh. And when we get into the text, you'll see that Jonah wasn't so much scared of the fact; it was more that God wasn't going to judge them. And what we'll learn is, there's there's a lot that they probably could have been judged for, more or less. Yeah. Tomb of Jonah. So this is kind of an interesting one. So this is just kind of a current event. So back in 2014, July 2014, this little pesky group called ISIS came in and actually blew up the Tomb of Jonah. And they actually went in and they were, this kind of goes outside the realm of this a little bit, but ISIS, they will go to biblical sites or ancient sites that supports pretty much the Bible, and they will destroy it. And that's really one of the ways that how they rewrite history. And they put their relics there or whatnot, or build a mosque there, and that's how they push it out. But what's interesting though is Jonah is actually in Islam is actually viewed as a prophet there, but they have their own twist and spin on it, of course. They don't.
Because I think Nineveh is in northern Iraq where the Kurds are.
Yes.
Which is where ISIS was making their headquarters, just on the southern border of Turkey and northern part of Iraq.
Right.
On the Tigris.
Exactly.
And I think they hit Damascus at the same time and destroyed
They
part
did.
of Damascus as
Yep.
well.
That
Which
was
the oldest civilization still in existence.
right. And it's kind of sad to think about just from a historical standpoint, and everything else. Because there's so much over there. I've never been to Israel. I've been told there's so much over there that when you're reading the Bible, you're walking through. You're staring at things in the face, and as they destroy the stuff, it's sad. And the funny thing is we have this one tiny book on Jonah and a couple passages, and that's really about it,
Well, and Saddam actually had protected it when he was in power, and he considered them treasures. He wasn't actually destroying them. He was actually building palaces around them, those relics, all that. And then once we took him out and ISIS came in, they made it a point just to go destroy it.
Right. It's crazy. All right, so the outline of Jonah, that's mini outline. So basically we have chapters 1 2 is Jonah flees, but we have Jonah's commission, the endangerment of the sailors and the cry to God. That is chapters 1 verses 4 through 6. Jonah's disobedience exposed, Jonah's punishment and deliverance, and his prayer and thanksgiving. That goes to the first two chapters. When we actually look at those, we're going to dive in and look at pretty much every aspect of it, because there's so much that's tucked away in the text, and so much that Christ fulfilled out of those texts. And when we get in there, we'll actually be able to kind of pull those elements out, and it's kind of neat to see. It's I guess you can say prophecies, kind of hindsight 2020, right? But when you know what you know now, and you can look back, you can actually apply it to that. It's kind of neat. You can actually pull that out. And then the last half, chapters 3 and 4. This will also be weeks 3 and 4 for us. Jonah's renewed commission, obedience, endangerment to Ninevites, repentance and appeal to the Lord. Ninevites' repentance and acknowledgement, and Jonah's deliverance and rebuke. And what's interesting about Jonah, the way that it ends and the way that it starts is Jonah starts out, at least it seems, sitting, and it ends with him sitting. I don't know. There might be some sort of significance to that, but you'll see what I'm talking about when we go get into the passages. But and the other thing too is the book of Jonah just kind of ends. It's like after everything's all said and done, it's like, well, now what? He went down, he gave the message, they repented. Now what? When we don't get that, it's like someone cut off the passages. To be continued. We're waiting for part 2 to come out, but it never did, I guess. All right, so
Short-lived.
yeah, short-lived. All right, so Jonah. The meaning of Jonah. So this is one of the interesting things about Jonah is the word Jonah itself actually means dove. Kind of a soft, simple term, but what's interesting about that is that's very symbolic in Scripture. So we have Noah and the account there where the dove on the ark comes back and it brings basically a form of salvation. Then you have, in Matthew, when Jesus is being baptized, the Holy Spirit came down on him like a dove. And then, obviously you have Jonah. Jonah here is the dove. And the dove always is kind of symbolic to redemption. Or sometimes even the Holy Spirit. That's the symbolism. But Jonah itself, in the Hebrew, is actually spelled with a yod, vav, a nun. That's what this is called, a nun, and a hey. So I know it's been a little while since our last study, but we went through the Hebrew alphabet and talked about how each letter has a meaning and each letter has a numerical value. Apparently, you can even apply musical notes to it. I didn't know that. So there's actually an entire website out there that took whole passages of Psalms and actually turned it into music. And it's actually amazing music. It really is. But I digress. Go back. Yeah. Afterwards, I can use the website. So what's interesting, yod means hand. Vav actually means either nail or nail. Nun is kind of a funny one because that can actually mean life, fish, it's kind of funny, and seed, that's the other one. But usually, the reason why they say like a fish or I think because fish moves, there's movement. So we're talking about life. And then hey is the word for inspiration or reveal, or sometimes it could be like behold.
We say, hey.
Yeah.
Hey, you.
Yeah, like, hey, guess what? So, yeah, it is. It's hey, exactly. But what's interesting is you have the hand, the nail, and the life that reveals. And it's all kind of written right there in the name of Jonah. And if you look at the whole theme of Jonah and what's going on, that's basically what he did. If he actually brought new life, he brought a new message which revealed the one with the hand and the nail. There's only one person I think we can apply to that, right? And that's kind of what he did. And it's kind of all wrapped up just in his name. I think that's kind of neat. And I'm sure there's probably more you can derive out of that, but we're not going to do that here. We'll do it for a long time. So the other thing I also want to go into is the ancient writers. The ancient writers, they actually also viewed Jonah in a different light. So we have Berosus, Josephus, Apollodorus, Herodias, and Diodorus. I don't know if I butchered it, but I don't think anybody could tell me wrong. So I want to focus on this guy here a little bit, because this guy, he actually writes on the ancient myth. It's called the story of Onias. I'm going to read this, and this is kind of interesting because this goes all the way back to Babylon, and it derives out of Babylon and goes to the time of the Greeks, and things were changed and kind of, to fit their day and time. And the guy that they write about, and it's a myth, this is their mythology of Onias. So keep in mind, this is what Jonah was going into. This is kind of, I'm assuming he probably knew a little bit about the Assyrians, what their beliefs were, a little bit about what he had to face when he arrived to Nineveh. Okay, so this is what Berosus writes about that. He goes, At first they led somewhat wretched existence and lived without rules and manners of the beast. But the first year appeared an animal endowed with human reason named Onias, who arose out of the Euphrates Sea at the point where at the borders of Babylon. He had the whole body of a fish, but above the fish head was another head, which was of a man, and feet emerged from beneath the fish tail. He had a human voice and an image of him preserved to this day. He passed the day in the midst of men without taking food. He taught that He taught them the use of letters, science, arts of all kinds. He taught them to construct cities and found temples, and compiled laws, and explained to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth, and showed them how to collect the fruits. In short, he instructed them everything which could tend to soften the human matters, to humanize their laws. From what time nothing material had been added by way of improvement or his instructions. And when the sun set, being Onias, retired again into the sea, for he was an amphibious. And after he appeared after this, there appeared another animal like Onias. So, this Onias, which is kind of interesting. So we can see the mythology there. This god, right, came and showed them all the ways. But again, there was another time where another person came again. What's funny about this is actually the Greek word of Onias, which can be translated back into the Babylonians. But what's funny is in the Greek, they dropped the Y's out of this. So really, if you were to add the Y to it, you would actually have Onias. And if you were to actually translate in the English, it would actually be more like Joannes, right? Or Jonas, which really means Jonah up here, which is kind of interesting. Now, don't know. We know that this was written in the 3rd century BC. However, it could have been modified, twisted. Matter of fact, maybe Jonah's visit to Nineveh and that area may have twisted the myth a little bit, especially when they talk about there's a man that returns. So, just kind of food for thought. This whole myth, I think, reveals a lot. And this is written in the 3rd century. 500 or 400 years prior to that, we had the Jonah existence. So that could lead to, guess what? There was most likely a real Jonah, which is kind of neat. All right, moving on to Josephus. Josephus, he's one of these guys. He writes about everything. He actually did an entire commentary on the entire Bible, verse by verse. I guess in his day and age, he was in his day and age, he was probably the great expositor, because he did literally verse by verse, and he applied the history of the current day, the current thinking, the current knowledge, and everything else. Man, can you imagine? He wrote in Jonah. Imagine that. I'm just going to read a little bit. This is a huge, long passage here. Yeah, it's probably half a book here, really. But we're just going to read a little bit of it, just kind of get the flavor here. Now, I cannot think it is necessary for me, who have promised to give an accurate account of the affairs, to describe the actions of this prophet, so far as I have found them written down in the Hebrew books. Jonah had been commanded by God to go to the kingdom of Nineveh, and when he was there, to publish it in the city, how it should be. Jonah had been commanded by God to go into the kingdom of Nineveh, and when he was there, to publish it in the city, and how it should be loosed the dominion it had over the nations. But he went not out of fear, nay, or ran away from God to the city of Joppa, and finding a ship there, and went into the city and sailed to Tarshish. And he goes on talking more about what actually happened there. But what's interesting, I like about that one little passage that Josephus talks about, is he actually acknowledged it wasn't the fact that he was scared, or more or less. Basically, really at the end of the day, it was the disobedience. And that's what the book talks about. And when you have an external source, even though I know Josephus was Jewish, but when you have an external source that aligns with what the Bible's talking about, that's a good thing. Because we know that there's validity. We have a few other characters, other Greek historians, and they are not as long, but I want to mention them. And that's your Apollodorus. He actually writes about this as early as Julian and Porphyry, pagan rituals, and the credibility of Christians believing and delivering of Jonah by fish. Some infidels have derived it from the heathen fable and deliverance of Adador. I can't even say that, from the sea monster by the Prometheus. Herodias writes this: from the Aryan musician thrown into the sea by the sailors and carried safe to shore by a dolphin. That's what Herodias talks about in his myth and rendition of that. And Diodorus from Hercules, who sprang up into the jaws of the sea monster and was 3 days and 3 nights in the bellies. And when he undertook to save Henosis. And I have no idea who Henosis is, but it's probably one of those Greek gods. But it's another rendition of Jonah. And it's funny because you see all these writers, and there's actually quite a few more. You have Homer as well, that go in and they keep talking about Jonah. So what's funny is you go throughout history, the Greeks really bit off on the Hebrew stories, and they kind of wrote their own stories and applied it to their own God. So a lot of times what you'll notice with a lot of the different cultures, like especially the Greeks, it's really easy just to apply a new God. It's like we got an open slot, and you know what? Hey, these guys have a pretty interesting fella. Come on in. We're going to plug you in. And they did. And they would make their own stories, and I guess maybe that was their way of coexisting. I don't know. But those are the ancient writers. And what I really like about these guys is they really do solidify the Jonah, the Jonah account that we have here. All right. We're making good time. All right. So we get to read verses 1 and 2. So whoever wants to kick it off, we'll just read verses 1 and 2. We'll break them down and go from there.
Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me.
Boom. There's a lot in that passage. And you guys are like, what? What are you talking about? No. We could be here all day. There really is. Okay, so what we notice here, and I'm going to use my Bible here. Just kind of give you some direction here. So what's funny is we have some key words that actually pop out here. So as we read the first verse, I'm just going to read it one more time, and then we'll break it down. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying. I'm just going to stop there because just with those few words, there's a lot that is driven out. So what you'll notice that with a lot of these prophets is you're going to get this pesky little word here.
Throw it in the trash.
All right, so word. Okay. What's funny is this word in the Hebrew is dabar. Okay, and I think we talked a little bit about dabar. Maybe. Yeah, I think we did last time. But what's funny is every one of these prophets either talk about a vision or the word coming upon them. And what's funny is when you get into the Septuagint, you get this little word called logos. And when you go back to John 1:1, when we talk about logos, logos is another title for Christ. And what's funny is if you look at the word arrangement in the actual original language, it's more of a title word more rather than an action word, because this down here is more the action, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But so basically, we're talking about a title. So a title of something, the word, the actual thing came upon them. And what is this thing? What we now know from John, Christ. Okay. The word for Lord, which is Yahweh, Jehovah. All right. And I don't know if you guys remember from last time, but we'll talk about it again here, just because we have time to do so. We got Yod, Hey, Vav, Hey. All right. They're going to fire me from Liberty. All right. So we got the Yod, which means hand, which reveals, and the nail, which reveals. Right. That's what that actually. That's what the symbolic meaning of what this Yod means hand, Vav means nail, and then your Hayes is reveals. So we're talking about Jehovah. Again, when you dig into that, and we did a whole study on that, we're talking, it's pointing back to Christ. Okay? So we're seeing Christ already wrapped up in the first sentence of Jonah, and we haven't gotten started yet. The Bible, these texts have a way of doing that, where they come out and they tell us that. Then we already talked about what Jonah means. Jonah is dove. Okay? And we know that we see basically the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit right in the first sentence there. But this little pesky word saying is something that's even interesting. So we go back to Genesis and we see the word Omar. Omar is actually the action word of Debar. Okay? But in the Greek, it's Legos. Okay? And basically, it's the action of this. So basically, the word is now actually doing something. Now it's actually saying. Now it's actually, what I always like to say is, when you go to Genesis, when you see the Lord says, or the Lord saying, and said, "Let there be," the entire creation is made out of Legos. I like that. And, I actually looked it up too, and guess what? Legos has nothing to do with that. I was so unhappy about that. I was really hoping to find a connection. All right, so we're going to go ahead and go into the verse 2, and we're going to conclude. All right, so verse 2, "Arise and go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it, for there is wickedness. Wickedness has come up before me." So, two big words. First off is arise and go. So remember I told you, it sounds like Jonah starts out sitting and he ends sitting. Well, if you have to arise, you got to get up. So obviously he was sitting. But what's interesting is this was not a suggestion. This was a command. All right. And I can relate with this right now. Right now, we're being called to go to Michigan. We're being called to do ministry up there, chaplain corps. And when you get that calling, you don't sit around. You start activating. You get up and go. But unfortunately, we all, as we know, Jonah did kind of an about face and did the opposite. And there's repercussions for that. Something to keep in mind. There's probably a great fish waiting for you if you do that. That's okay. That's okay. God has a way of using that. But what's funny is in the Greek, this word is poreo, P-O-R-E-U-O, I think, something like that. This is the same word that's used for the Great Commission. Okay, so that's the same word when it says "go," that Christ is using for the Great Commission. Go, make disciples of all nations. Guess what? He's calling Jonah to go and make, well, not so much disciples, but they were. He was bringing Nineveh to redemption, bringing them to the Lord. And then the last one is Nineveh themselves. So Nineveh is going to be representation. Make sure I get my notes right. Yeah, Nineveh is going to be representation of the earth. Okay, Nineveh obviously was a big capital at that time. There was actually, I think, last time I read, it was like 120,000 people there, plus maybe even more. So this is representation of the world. And if we know anything about Nineveh, there was a lot of sin there. There was everything that was detestable to God, and that's there in the text. They sinned against God, and He needs to change that course. So this is actually representing the world, and then this is actually really representing, you say, Christ, salvation. All right. So we're getting this picture here that you're getting a snapshot of what the mission is to bring salvation to these people that are fallen. And here's the sad part. Who are we in this picture? Right, and before we were saved, we're Nineveh. And that's a sad reality. We always focus on Jonah, and we're like, how could he do that? This guy was an idiot. Why would he not, follow God? But really, we were Nineveh. But when you have Christ, that changes. Now, to conclude, what's interesting about Jonah is I actually noticed in my studies is there seems to be a threefold structure, or three. I like to actually really call it 3 layers. There's obviously the actual story of Jonah itself. There are actual events, actual things that took place. So I'm going to say the first one is actual events. Okay, this is an actual history, what actually happened, and it's recorded for us, and we are kind of the benefactors of that. But along with that, there's also a lot of symbolism in here that was kind of I won't say, I guess, hidden, I guess you would say. I have to be careful how I say that. But there's a lot of symbolism here that at that time they didn't fully understand until Christ came, okay? And then that's where you have the fulfillment, or the fulfillment of Messiahship. Okay, so you have the fulfillment. And so when you actually look at the entire structure of Jonah, you have the actual events, you have symbolism there, and then you see the fulfillment with Christ. And that's actually one of those things that you can actually measure. You look at all these other crazy books, these Gnostic books and things like that. A lot of them, they don't have that fulfillment. They have actually very little historical fact. They have a lot of things that are made up or skewed. And funny thing is, we can pinpoint that stuff. But here we can see this with Jonah, and Jonah reveals a lot about that. And when we start getting into the kind of the nitty gritty of when Jonah got ate and stuff like that, you'll actually start realizing there's a lot more to it than just the surface things. So next week I'm actually going to dive into the text. We're going to go through the first chapter, and we're going to break it down, look at all the little things there, and see where Jonah's going to lead us. And I'm sure we'll have a lot more discussion next week on that. That's all I got. Any questions?